And we're about to bring on our next panel, but we do have a special speaker intervention that we'd like to now share and introduce to our audience here. Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, member of the Elders, and co-founder of Project Dandelion. We welcome you, Mary. Thank you so much for joining us, Mary.
Thank you, Osprey and WECAN, for bringing us together in this important conversation before we meet in Santa Marta in Colombia to talk about phasing out and just transition from fossil fuels. It's so urgent that we prepare well for that meeting. And we prepare well if we think about what came out of Belém, that sense of coalitions of the willing. What do we mean by that? I think we mean layered coalitions. Of course we need the governments, but we also need business. We also need academia. We need artists. But above all else, we need the frontline workers. We need the indigenous. We need the young. We need the activists. But we also need to bring in the voices that haven't been involved. We've got to reach out into maybe sports or all kinds of areas, really, really make this the broadest coalition. And the way we do it, I think, is from community up. In communities, we can do things together. We can do things on food sovereignty in countries. We can do things on learning from indigenous wisdom about the connections between the way in which we see ourselves as part of nature and how we tackle the climate problem in general. Climate and nature are two sides of a one coin. So I think we really need to harness as best we can the widest possible layered coalition of the willing. Those of us who link with governments can help that link. Those of us who are very close to grassroots life would say WECAN is a model of that. With your connections with indigenous, young, etc. You can help to ground us in the indigenous wisdom, but we do need to collaborate as never before. Radical communication, radical collaboration, radical connection, and the excitement of it, because we know that technology is moving very fast. Actually, governments are still too slow. The goals they set are still too weak because they don't uphold them, but the technology is moving very fast. Let's realize it's not just a matter of technology, it's a matter of how we ensure that that technology is available for all. I'm talking in particular about solar technology and wind technology, that it's accessible to the poorest communities. I've seen this happen. I've seen SEWA in India, the Self-Employed Women's Association, transform the lives of 3.8 million women through insurance, through healthcare, through access to solar energy, etc. And they're not alone. It's happening all over the world. It's happening in Pakistan, their next door neighbor. Solar is really moving because it's happening at grassroots. We need the stories of the good examples. We need to gather our sense of a storytelling purpose going forward, that we highlight what is working well, that we highlight those in communities, like I see in Ireland, my own country, those who are involved in much more diverse agri-ecology, not just beef and dairy, which is the main government policy towards food production. No, we need to diversify, we need to listen, and we need to bring in everybody's voice so that we can strengthen these layered coalitions of the willing. And then when we meet up in Santa Marta, we need to feel we are connected to purpose, because we're going to talk about something really important, just transition. And I want to say a few words about that. We need to talk about just transition out of fossil fuel. And that is different in different countries and in different regions. We've got to realize that. The countries that built their economies on fossil fuel must move faster. And we need to understand, but we also need just transition into affordable, accessible, clean energy for all, and that is all. And so it's the informal sector, it's indigenous, it's all. And I'm really looking forward to being with so many of you in Santa Marta. The Elders will be there, the Guardians of Planetary Boundaries will be there, Project Dandelion, of course, will be there, and we will do our best to work with you in WECAN and with all the others who are part of this layered coalition of the willing that we must build. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that Mary could join us. A really important leader of our time who's been working on these issues for a very long time indeed. And thank you so much, Mary. And I'm now really excited about our next panel. Um, I want to welcome an outstanding group of leaders who are presenting on the panel called Government Leaders for a Fossil Fuel Phase-Out, which is really thrilling to have you here as we get ready for the conference in Santa Marta. I want to thank you all for your important work and leadership at this time, especially as we prepare for the historic first conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels, hosted by the governments of Colombia and the Netherlands. And just yesterday, I saw that it was announced that so far there are 45 countries that have committed to participating in the conference held in Santa Marta. So that's just really excellent news. And this assembly panel today is being hosted by the parliamentarians for a fossil fuel-free future and the Fossil Fuel Treaty and WECAN. And WECAN is very honored to serve on the steering committee for the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and also to have with us today my dear friend and colleague, Zipporah Berman, who will moderate this panel, and she'll be introducing the different speakers. Zipporah is the founder and chair of the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and she has generated enormous momentum to achieve the goals of this crucial initiative worldwide, including generating critical guidance for the government-led conference in Colombia this April. And I'm just so thankful you could be here with us, Zipporah, and for your leadership in all the work that you're doing. And before I hand the floor to you, we just heard this news this morning that Daniela Duran Gonzalez, who was to be on this panel, got pulled away, which is understandable given that this conference is coming up and she needed to attend to some urgent matters. She's the head of the international affairs from the Colombian Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia. But we wanted to just have 2 minutes of having her voice here. We happened to capture her intervention at COP30 when we were in Brazil. We were in the room when she spoke out about the fossil fuel phase out, and we felt it was important to have her voice here since she's been really instrumental in all of this work. So we're going to show her video, and then Zipporah, please take the floor. So we'll do that. Thank you.
Mr. President, this is the cup of the truth. This is the cup of trust. And you are leaving us with no other option after the procedural issues that we are seeing in this plenary, after you ignored our point of order before the mitigation program was gavelled so we could propose this insertion for the consideration of the plenary, but to object the mitigation work program. The cup of the truth cannot support an outcome that ignores science. According to the IPCC, nearly 75% of global CO2 emissions come from fossil fuels. There is no mitigation if we cannot discuss transitioning away from fossil fuels with means of implementation in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. And the mitigation work program needs this space so we can actually talk about mitigation within the UNFCCC. Today, we're not even allowed to discuss pathways for a just, orderly, and equitable transition aligned with the best available science. This language, previously agreed by consensus, is now being vetoed, even though it is essential for the integrity of this process. A consensus imposed under climate denialism is a failed agreement, Mr. President. Colombia is not blocking progress, contrary to what is happening and how the narrative is making us look here. We are demanding the minimum necessary guarantees, which is to allow language, a topic that we already agreed by consensus, to be discussed here. Denying the best available science requires us not only put the climate regime at risk, but also our own existence. Which message are we sending the world, Mr. President? We're really sorry that we need to do this. Colombia wants to move forward. We want to be based on science with peoples, with the indigenous peoples, the Afro-descendant peoples, the peasants, the women, the youth, the people that it's out there asking us to deliver an outcome that includes fossil fuels, that is transparent, And we feel that we couldn't have the chance to do this, and you're leaving us with no other option. So I'm sorry, Mr. President, but Colombia objects the mitigation work program. Thank you.
So that was from COP30, and I think it's an important intervention that really sets the stage for all of these governments going forward in Colombia. And I would very much now like to invite Zipporah Berman to take the floor and guide us through this next panel. Thank you, Zipporah.
Thank you so much, Osprey. It's such a joy to be here with all of you and the whole WECAN community. And what a great way to start this panel with Daniela. That fire, that commitment to science, to honesty, to justice, incredibly important. And Colombia's leadership over the last many months, well, for many years, but since Belém, the work that they are doing every day to try and to ensure that this conference is going to be a success is astounding in an incredibly short period of time. And so really want to start by congratulating Colombia on the announcement from yesterday that there are 45 countries committed at a high level to attend this diplomatic conference, which is outside of the United Nations space. And I think it's important for people to understand how both difficult that is and unusual, though there is historical precedent, and we need to remember that. Many issues that have been intransigent within the UN space because there are vested interests which constantly challenge them, which of course we've seen for years within the UNFCCC space on fossil fuels, have had to move outside of the UN in order to achieve progress. And in fact, the idea of the Santa Marta Conference came from studying other treaties and recognizing, for example, that the Ottawa Convention was the first diplomatic conference on landmines and was critical and essential to becoming a pathway for a true plan for the landmine treaty. And there are many other examples. And so the idea of a diplomatic conference was actually proposed at a fossil fuel treaty ministerial meeting over a year ago, and then Colombia stepped forward to announce that they would indeed host it, and now the Netherlands is co-hosting, and I think it really is a historic moment. So we have today for you an incredible panel of government leaders who are going to talk about this moment and the conference to come and their perspectives. I think I just want to take a couple of minutes to set some context, because besides the context of the conference, there has never been a more exciting, I think, and also challenging moment for this conversation. The wars in the Middle East and the Ukraine are causing devastating suffering, loss of lives, and livelihood, and they're also throwing the vulnerability and instability and concentrated power and control of the fossil fuel economy into stark relief. I think that context and what people are now realizing, while of course there have been wars for oil before, never before has it happened in a moment when we have a situation where renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels all over the world, where we have capacity now for renewable energy and battery storage from a technological perspective that we never had. So while we're seeing the violence and vulnerability of the fossil fuel system, it's also at a moment when we know that it can be replaced. The majority of fossil fuel uses can be replaced, and in fact, many countries are already doing it. And so I think while the scarcity and price shocks are devastating, I also think that they are starting to push even more countries into thinking about fossil fuel phase out, even not from a climate perspective, but from a perspective of recognizing that cleaner, safer energy systems also lead to national security and energy security. And I think that's a really important context for this conversation. And then finally, I will just also add a little context on the ecological moment we're in, because we have seen over the last year, given the politics and the war. And last week, the World Meteorological Association put out its annual assessment, and it included the Earth's energy imbalance as a key climate indicator. What they report is that pent-up heat in the Earth isn't just growing, it's accelerating rapidly, throwing the Earth completely out of balance. These are complicated issues, but what is not is that burning oil, gas, and coal has driven CO2 concentrations that are now wrapping around the Earth like a sweltering blanket to the highest level in 2 million years. And this year alone, we've seen thousands and thousands of people losing their homes and livelihoods as a result of the floods and the fires and the extreme weather. And we now know, as a result of the Lancet report, that 1 person every minute is losing their lives due to lethal heat on the planet. That's the context for this conversation. And we cannot forget that. I think of it sometimes like staring into the sun. We need to stare into the sun. We need to be able to hold that urgency with the opportunity and the commitment to building hope. And I think that's what we're doing in Santa Marta. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said this week, in this age of war, climate stress, it's also exposing another truth. Our addiction to fossil fuels is destabilizing both the climate and global security. So there never was a more important moment for this conversation. Without further ado, let's get to it. I'm hopeful. I'm not sure. I don't see him here, but I'm going to hope that he is. We're going to turn first to Perpetua Latasi, the Director of the Department of Climate Change and Disaster, Office of the Prime Minister of Tuvalu. Tuvalu was the second country to join and the participating nations in developing the fossil fuel treaty. And thrilled to see Tuvalu's continued leadership, not only, of course, on the decision by the International Court of Justice decision last year, but also on the fossil fuel treaty and really leading some of the exciting conversations right now. Okay, I've just been told that he has not yet arrived. So we'll hold on Tuvalu and hope that he will be joining us shortly. And in the meantime, MP Esther, I'm going to be turning to you. I know you're here because I saw you. We're very lucky to have Esther Nicholas Matiko, a member of the Parliament of Tanzania, the Global Steering Committee member for Africa, Parliamentarians for a Fossil-Free Future Network in Tanzania. Over to you.
Thank you very much. As you have introduced me, I have to save my time. I just extend my sincere gratitude to WECAN and the Treaty Initiative for inviting us to co-host this important panel. I'm a member of a Global Steering Committee of the Parliamentarians for Fossil Fuel Network, together with my colleague MP Cecile of Brazil and Ciel from Philippines, who are also both in this panel with me. The truth on the ground contrasts the global climate debate with Tanzanian reality. While the world talks about the phase out, millions of African women are still in a phase-in struggle, fighting for basic access to clean and reliable energy. In Tanzania, Women's Month is not just a celebration. It's a reminder of the hours women spend trekking for firewood. Our transition is not just about carbon. It's about the liberation of women's time and health. I expect in St. Marta, we need a leapfrog grantee that will result from the meeting that we're going to hold on St. Marta. It must produce than just a timeline for the leach. We need a commitment that the Global South will be provided the financial and technical ladder to skip the fossil fuel era entirely without compromising the development. Fighting for sovereignty over extractions. A main point of progress should be a global agreement that protects developing nations from being used as the resource colonies. We must ensure that we phase out fossils. We don't replace them with a green mineral rush that exploit African land without powering African homes. We also have to need to look on the debt cancellation as a climate action. A true progress in Santa Marta will be linking fossil fuel phase out to total debt cancellation. We cannot invest in a green future while our nation budgets are dialed by interest payment to the very nation that caused the crisis we have. I expect that the policy advancement needed for fossil fuel future, one should be mainstreaming the clean cooking as a human right. Our national legislation must prioritize the clean cooking energy. For Tanzanian women, the fossil fuel future starts in her kitchen. We need the policy that subsidize electric and solar cooking technology as a matter of public health. We also need to look on the policy advancement on the green grab and to end the green grabbing. We must strengthen local legislation to ensure that larger scale renewable projects like massive solar farms do not lead to land displacement. Rather, we need a democratic renewable energy. That means the community, they need to own the land and the power. We need to build resilience against the geopolitical shocks by advising policies that lead to energy independence. This is how we address the Middle East conflict, by building decentralized solar and wind grids. We insulate our local economies from wars fought over oil pipelines and thousands of miles away. For the transition away from fossil fuel to be effective, we need policies that provide renewable energy incentives, including subsidies, tax exemptions, and feed-in tariff to stimulate investment and development. We need to improve infrastructure for renewable energy, including modernization of the grid and upgrading to smart grid technology. We also need international cooperation for technology transfer and climate finance that indeed must be provided for the developing country. As a message for the Women's Month in Tanzania and for Africa, I believe, women are the keeper of the earth, the fierce and faithful guardians for the generation to come. Women are the conscience of the house. Women parliamentarians bring the budget of the kitchen to the table of the state. We are the ones who demand that energy policy save the household, not just the industrial complex. We women legislators, we think of the long term, while men often legislate for the next election. Women legislators, we legislate for the next generation. This Women Month, we assert that the phase out must be a pro-family, pro-growth, and pro-peace policy. With my closing remarks, I can put this as the women parliamentarians, we are not asking for charity. We are demanding for the space to lead. The fossil fuel era was built on the exploitation of the global south, and the renewable energy era must be built on the empowerment, fairness, and equity. The development, the so say, require fire and smoke, but the true power is like the sun. It rises for everyone. It costs nothing to solve. It belongs to no one. We are the women who care the water and the wood. But today, we are the women who care the laws. We'll not just transition away from the fuel of the past. We'll lead the way to the future where the only thing we burn is our passion for justice. And it's my honor to let you know that, or rather to inform you, our president, Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, is the champion of the clean cooking in Africa. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow. Thank you so much. I couldn't even begin to summarize your remarks because you just covered so much ground, and you shifted the conversation into stark relief to be a conversation about access, about justice, about democracy. Exactly, I said Daniela lit a fire under us going into Santa Marta, but now I feel that that clear sense of purpose. So many terms that you used are so critical for this conversation. We keep talking about it from the global north as a transition. What you talked about, the leapfrog guarantee, the capacity support, the ensuring that the world that we're creating is not recreating the world of the past with displacement from renewables, etc. I just, MP Esther, thank you so much for setting that context for this panel. I hope you can stay. We'll come back to you again for more comments after we hear some of the other speakers. I know that your community has suffered a loss and you may not be able to stay. And if not, we understand you've left us so much to learn from and think about. So thank you so much. Turning now to yet another amazing government women leader. I'm so thrilled that we have Federal Deputy Celia Chacriaba with us, the Federal Deputy in the Brazilian Congress in the state of Minas Gerais and the co-founder of the National Association of Indigenous Women Warriors of Ancestry from Brazil. Celia, the floor is yours.
Pardon, just a quick intervention here. Please remember to use your interpretation button for those of you at the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
Obrigada por esse espaço, Osprey, WECAN.
Thank you very much for this space, Osprey, WECAN, por esse momento de, because of this moment of dialogue. After a week, we were talking about a future free of fossil fuels, and to dialogue, this is in our proposal of legislation, considering nature as a right subject. Everyone in Brazil have already thought and proposed law projects to think on nature on a subject of rights. We know that the fossil fuel exploitation is predatory. I am author of this project of law to amend the constitution to recognize nature as a subject of rights in Brazil. And for doing this, we need 1,700 of signatures, and we already collected more than a half of, and this means that we are quite close. And I, as a parliamentarian, I recognize how important it was to be the president of the Commission of Traditional and Indigenous Peoples, since the largest threat is in the Amazon mouth, and we know that more 400,000 indigenous are threatened. It's like the Gaza in our territories. In 2023, we launched the group for the planet, Bancada pelo Planeta, and we committed with the Agenda COP30 for a future free of mining, free of fossil fuels, since in all the state of Minas Gerais, in which 85% of lithium in Brazil is here in our state. And this is a state that speaks about rare lands exploitation, and China is the main country who is exploiting here, but at the same time, Brazil is the second largest country, which is the center of the view of the world of these rare lands. And we can join us in our discussion during the COP in Brazil about our law project. Without women, there's no climate. And the idea is to involve women and girls and to monitor the harm they are suffering because of fossil fuel exploitation or mining exploitation or strategic minerals exploitation. And this law project was filed in several different countries, Canada, Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, and we are talking about it in Brazil. We started it in Brazil in the COP30, and with a lot of joy, this project was approved, passed in the National Congress after a very important discussion. Even the PL party, which is the more conservative party in Brazil, because when you affect us, you affect all the women. And what to do to face violence? According to the UN, it says that when the temperature increases 1 degree, it is an increase of 5% of violence against women and girls. And 30 girls were sexually exploited in exchange of food in the illegal mining here in Brazil. We are talking about a parliamentary front for a fossil fuel-free world. And in the National Congress, my party filed a project in favor of areas free of fossil fuels exploitation. And they tell us, you are very contradictory. You talk about the end of the fossil fuels, but you use fossil fuels. But we are saying that we need to have areas totally free of fossil fuels, and they are enough to, and that the areas that are already working here in Brazil that exploit fossil fuels, they are enough to provide to all the world. And there was another big debate in COP30 and in the biodiversity COP in Colombia, and we got to integrate the final document for ending fossil fuels in critical areas. But actually, all the areas are critical. People are starting to say sustainable, but now they are trying to talk about sustainable fossil fuels, sustainable mining, but that is not sustainable. The environmental agenda needs to include humanitarian agendas, as well as facing violence against women needs to be included as humanitarian agenda, because when they kill women, it is a crime against humanity. We are killing the today and the tomorrow. That is futuricide. We are killing the possibility of life in the plant. And to finalize, I want to thank Osprey for this project. We have more than 4 projects of law that are filed in the Congress. Who doesn't care of Earth will not care of the planet. So we need to think in our responsibility. We are much more than women working our work. Our responsibility, our courage will allow us to prevent the death of humanity. We need to discuss about the economy of death, because the smarter economy is that protect life and forests.
Obrigado. Obrigado.
Thank you so much, Celia. I'm never going to forget that stat. 1 degree of warming equals 5% increase in violence for women and girls. I hadn't heard that before. I'm wondering, while we still have you and you still have connectivity, I'm hoping you're using translation so you can hear me. You said that you have 4 legal cases going through the Congress right now, and I may have missed it, but I caught the rights of nature case, the fossil-free zones case. Could you take a couple of minutes more just to explain the other bills that you have going through proposed in Congress?
We have 4 law proposals. The mapping violence from climate information, it is already approved. We have another law proposal that was approved in the Senate, that is to establish September 5 as the National Day to Face Violence against women and girls, indigenous women and girls. We have another proposal of law to the indigenous women to have their own measures to face violence, and this is to change the penal code to face the violence against women, indigenous women and girls. And we have another one that proposed to name Quilombolan indigenous and with their own terms, indigenous and Quilombolas areas. And also we approved the indigenous university in February, and that indigenous university at the end, it will be also a climate university. The indigenous university, it is ancestral and for the future. And I also wrote that law proposal, and some of them, they need only a little more signatures to be approved. And that's why we have another project that was approved in the COP that recognizes the indigenous territories and traditional communities as climate schools in Brazil. Today, we have more than 2,000 proposals in the National Congress in less than 4 years of mandate.
Wow, that is incredible. That is fantastic. Thank you so much for your leadership, and part of what I think we're all hoping to do as we hear about these initiatives is encourage others in other regions to take them up as well. And certainly, I think Santa Marta will be a time for that, with 45 other governments coming. So frustrating to hear the response that you're often getting around, well, you use fossil fuels. And I think there's probably no one here who is an organizer who hasn't had to deal with that. I think it is so incredibly absurd. I said to someone the other day, so you've been criticizing the health system and calling for reforms. Yes. So do you use the health system right now? Like, and we need systemic change, which is what we're calling for. And so the whole idea that somehow, we have to be complete 100% objectors in order to be able to be concerned by the fossil fuel system and want it to be ramped down is just so crazy. Hoping you can stick with us with your internet connectivity, and we will come back to you for more. If people have questions, they are welcome to put their questions in the chat. I will do my best to see them, and I'm going to ask Ashley and the team there, if you see them and I don't, to send them to me on WhatsApp. And we're going to get some time for questions for the leaders that we have with us. We have another pre-recorded message right now, which is important, that we wanted to share with you. Deputy Minority Leader of the House of Representatives from the Philippines, Chelo Crisel Lagman, was not able to join us. She is with Parliamentarians for a Fossil-Free Future Network, and also a Global Steering Committee member for Asia. Let's turn to her message now.
Warm greetings of solidarity from the 1st District of Albay, which I have the honor of representing in the Philippine Congress, where I also serve as Deputy Minority Leader. Thank you to our co-organizers, the Fossil Free Treaty Initiative and WECAN. Our Parl Fossil Free Network is honored to co-host this panel on government leaders for a fossil fuel phase-out with you. Before entering Congress, I served as mayor of Tabaco City for 15 years. For a decade and a half, I bore witness to the lived realities of our people, the ravages of torrential rains and extreme flooding. The Philippines sits in the Western Pacific Typhoon Belt, the most active on Earth. In Albay, we face up to 18 typhoons a year. In fact, forecasts for April through June 2026 alone predict up to 5 tropical cyclones near our shores. The people of Albay live on the front lines. We are suffering the dire consequences of a climate crisis we did not create. The lived experience is why I gravitated toward the Parliamentarians for a Fossil-Free Future Network. It is a privilege to serve on our Global Steering Committee alongside women leaders like MP Celia Jacques Criaba of Brazil, and MP Esther Batico of Tanzania, who are also with us today. As we conclude National Women's Month, we must recognize that women are not just victims of climate change. More importantly, they are the architects of the solution. Today, we pay tribute to the women who nurture life and protect our common home by leading the equitable transition away from fossil fuels. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently warned that every key climate indicator is flashing red. Our planet is being pushed beyond its limits. With global greenhouse gas concentrations at record highs, the changes we make now will have repercussions for hundreds, potentially thousands of years. The evidence is undeniable. Fossil fuels are the primary culprit. Our collective voice must now shift from asking why to determining how. We need a fair, well-managed phase-out that ensures the Global South is not left to carry the burden alone. To achieve this, I propose 5 critical points for our legislative consideration. First, strengthening national mandates. We must translate global pledges into binding national laws, supported by non-debt creating finance and technical assistance from the global north. Second, plotting hard phase-out dates. We must move beyond encouraging renewables. We need laws that explicitly ban new coal, oil, and gas exploration, with hard retirement dates for existing infrastructure, following the lead of our peers from Latin America, from the Parl Fossil Free Network, who have already filed such bills in parliaments of Colombia, Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru. Third, driving financial reform. We must cut financial incentives for fossil fuel projects. We need to strengthen investment laws to ensure banks, insurers, asset managers, and other financial institutions stop funding the destruction of our climate by funding fossil fuels. Fourth, budgeting for renewables. We need budget legislation that signals a clear government mandate to shift toward sustainable, equitable, renewable energy investments. And lastly, fifth, enhancing legislative oversight. We must provide spaces for open dialogue to help drive the energy transition. And these dialogues must be participatory, transparent, and a vehicle for accountability. In Albay, these dialogues led us to become the first Philippine province to declare a climate emergency. We have pledged to peak our fossil fuel use this year, become a renewable energy hub by 2030, and reach 100% renewable energy by 2050. These targets started with small, tough conversations. Now we are taking those conversations to the global stage. Next month, from April 24 to 29, we gather in Santa Marta, Colombia, for the first conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels. Our Parl Fossil Free Network has been requested by the Colombian government to lead the parliamentary engagement for this landmark event. The ongoing unrest in the Middle East is a stark reminder that as long as our economies are shackled to fossil fuels, we are at the mercy of geopolitical volatility. As Secretary General Guterres said, Our addiction to fossil fuels is destabilizing both the climate and global security. This crisis can be the needed push to transition away from fossil fuels towards energy sovereignty and security, a pathway to lasting peace. Delay is deadly. We must transition as soon as possible, as widely as possible, and in the most just manner possible. This movement will be led by women, the intelligent, empathetic, and resilient caretakers of our earth. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Chilo. I have this image in my head from your use of the term shackled. The only other time I actually heard that was by the Minister of Finance from Antigua, Barbuda, when he joined the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and he said that the fossil fuels are the shackles around our wrists, and the fossil fuel treaty will be what removes those shackles. And that term is so important. And your phrase of women being the architects of solutions is so incredibly empowering. Thank you so much. We will be coming back to you with more questions on the how, because that was a great 5-point list. We'll dig into that a little bit more, I think, if we have time. Starting to see a couple of questions in the Q&A part, so we will get to those. But first, I'm so thrilled that we have in person another incredible woman leader. We have the senator in the 27th Senate House, recent councillor in Sligo County Council, Ireland, Nessa Cosgrove, with us. So glad you could join us. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours. Oh, Nessa, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I'm okay now?
Yes,
Thank
now
you
we can
so
hear you.
much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me along. And it's so wonderful to be hearing, voices from the global south that often we live. I suppose we're so far up north on our own as an island that we often don't hear other voices. So it's a real honor for me to be here. Like you introduced there, I was a member. I come from a community work background myself and come up from youth work. So I would listen to the voice of young people a lot, which was, I suppose, would have influenced my involvement in part of this, I suppose, movement. And also since I got elected to the Seanad, which was only since last year. And I've seen more than ever, like I'm a spokesperson for the Labour Party, which is, I share a similar party with Mary Robinson, which is a real honour. But since I've become elected, my spokespersonship is on workers' rights and balanced development. But more often than not, I end up talking about climate catastrophe and climate change, and which I didn't envisage myself. And I'm just your own speakers like Chelio, Esther, and Celia, like what they have pointed out, like the 5-point plan, they're realistic, and I think that just from my own involvement, in my own party, and in the Seanad itself, it is women that are talking most, and we know that women are disproportionately affected, by climate change, and I never would have related, I suppose, violence against girls and women as part of that conversation. So that's something I have really learned from tonight. I would never have taken that into account. But I think just from an Irish point of view, what I'd like to speak about tonight is, we made a commitment in 2022 that we declared a climate emergency, and that was a proud moment for Ireland. But unfortunately, we haven't followed that through with real action, and I think disproportionately, I think again we see the impact that our use of fossil fuels and our use of constant obsession with economic growth is having on the global south. And I think that, I suppose, and we can really see this now at the moment because of the turbulence like everyone has spoken about here, and the war in the Middle East, how much we are dependent on big businesses, big nations making decisions that are having an impact for people, everyday lives of people. I'm going to talk about fracking, which is an area that I would have like when Dervla Richardson, who was a huge, very big climate ambassador, when she asked me to become involved in this conversation. Fracking is something, I suppose, which affects the part of Ireland where I live. I live in the northwest, and there is shale rock there that we know that there's a potential to use for the extraction of fracked gas. We've seen from Pennsylvania the impact that it can have, and we've seen, I suppose, the detrimental effects that it's having on people's health, on childhood cancers, on cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses, and I think through grassroots movements here in Ireland, we have prevented any extraction of fossil fuels in Ireland itself. But that hasn't taken away from the fact that now we are opened up ourselves as a country just in the last 3 months to the importation of fracked gas. So I think this again is very much leads into this conversation that we're having here, that we have decided it's okay for us to not have the extraction of fracked gas on our island, but yet it seems the government at the moment think it's okay then to have other people fracking gas in other countries while we can import it. And I think that's why there has been a lot of grassroots movement here in Ireland. And I think there's something to be learned from. There's different groups between up the north of Ireland and where I live and further down south about to prevent, and these grassroots movements have really influenced government policies. So I suppose what I would like to see from this conversation that we're having is that not only do we have to invest in our own infrastructure, anyone that knows Ireland knows that it rains a lot and knows that we have, we're surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean. So we have huge potential to use offshore wind, but there is very much a reluctance to invest in renewable energies, which, we're missing our climate targets. We are, we can see the impact that it's having globally, but yet there seems to be some resistance to actually properly invest in non-fossil fuel infrastructure, particularly like wind energy, which we know we can do. So I think I'm here as someone to learn, because I think LNG is something that's been pushed here a lot. And we've seen that LNG prices has risen by 60% since the conflict broke out in the Middle East. And it's detrimental. It's another, I suppose, it is banned in a lot of countries around in Europe for the extraction here itself. But we had up to this year banned the importation. But things have changed, and I think we're taking a regressive step in Ireland rather than actually a progressive step. And I think that's particularly to do with the government that is in the government policy that is in existence in Ireland at the moment. But I think that we can see that, how our children, I suppose, are the ones here in Ireland that drove a lot of this grassroots campaigns. And there was an emphasis, but then in the last year, things have shifted again. Like you spoke about very early on, Spora, that you spoke about energy security. And I think at the moment, things haven't actually, there's a lot more to this now than about fossil fuel infrastructure, about climate change, and about the fact that we say something like LNG, again, is 80% more warming than carbon. Things that often get overlooked, but now we're going to start talking about energy security, food security, and global uncertainty, I suppose, is a conversation that has resulted on our dependence on fossil fuel infrastructure. But I think we have a lot to learn. I am so delighted to be here today, because I've learned, even from me sitting here for the last, hour, I have learned so much from women. I really do believe that women are the ones that are going to change this, because we're the most impacted by it. And I think that I have learned a lot, and I think it's very important for us to hear, exactly like your last speaker says, the climate chaos and the climate catastrophe that's happening in the global south that they didn't cause. And I think that's very important for us that live in the Northern Hemisphere to hear that, So thank you very much for this opportunity. And I look forward to be continuing to be more involved.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm really so thrilled that you brought into the conversation the power of grassroots movements and the success of those movements so far. We're keeping our fingers crossed for you, but urging people to do more than fingers crossed in Ireland on fracking. And partially, I feel like that's from the very beginning what WECAN has been about, not only surfacing issues and voices that don't get heard and need to be heard, but in really focusing on, okay, what are we doing together to build power? Because
Yeah.
these issues are not just about having the right finance or the right technology, or awareness, as people often like to say. This is about power, and it's about power in the hands of very few. And
Yeah.
and what we do see in a lot of places around the world is that we can build power to counter that very concentrated power of the fossil fuel industry. But it takes a lot of hard organizing to do that. And sometimes you have to do it over and over again. I've been feeling that a lot in Canada right now. And you and I should talk about LNG and fracking, because it's it's been growing significantly here in Canada. I have a lot of experience with that. But as someone who's been involved in climate issues now for well over 25 years, and it comes and goes, right? We get the awareness, and then we get bursts of action from individuals or movements that have pushed individuals to act. And then a new government comes in, and then, or some economic circumstance or war takes attention away, and then it comes again. And we need persistence. I was speaking with a chief of an indigenous nation here recently, and I said, God, I'm so tired. Like, how many times do we have to fight to get climate back on the agenda? And he just looked at me with this kind of really wry smile and said, "Oh, you're tired." And I was reminded of the persistence and resistance of indigenous nations around the world, and how important that is. So I'm really glad that you brought that into the conversation. Um, I'm going to turn now to a couple of questions that came in the chat, and then I'm going to come back to all of our speakers with a final question. One of the questions that's come up in the chat and in the Q&A is, well, what can I do? This Santa Marta moment is exciting. People have been texting me. I see you this must be live streamed somewhere, because people have been texting me. I see you on the live stream. What am I supposed to be doing? How do I be a part of this moment? I have put in the chat here a link, and I'll say it out loud for those who are on the live streams, to a website that's been created by the movement of the People's Summit, called fossilfreerising.org. This is a big combination of movements and groups that are working together to create a People's Summit in Santa Marta, but also creating a platform for you to organize at home, whether that's calling on your elected official or your governments to come to Santa Marta to produce their own fossil fuel phase-out plan, or to join the fossil fuel treaty, or also just organizing an event during Santa Marta. So we see this movement and grassroots organizing around the world. So there's some resources there and some connections there at fossilfreerising.org. And so I encourage people to do that. A lot of people have been asking me about the distinction between the fossil fuel treaty and the conference, and will the conference be a time to build the fossil fuel treaty? So I thought I might take a minute to answer that. The this conference in Santa Marta is much wider than fossil fuel treaty. It is a fossil fuel phase-out conference. It is co-hosted by identified 3 different tracks of conversation that will happen there, and outcomes from those tracks. So again, we'll put the link to Santa Marta, the formal conference, in the chat. But there's one track that they've identified, which is on international cooperation. And it is there that we see the conversations on the fossil fuel treaty kind of landing and we hope growing. We will be, as Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, hosting a senior officials technical meeting and a ministerial meeting the days before the conference. Many of you probably know that this conference is turning into a whole week of activity. So there is the academic Policy and Science Summit. There's the People's Summit. There's the Fossil Fuel Treaty official technical meeting and ministerial. There is a roundtable that's, I think, being hosted by We Mean Business on fossil fuel phase out for business. There is a roundtable being hosted by C40 and Under 2 Coalition on subnationals. And I don't know, I've heard that there's also a roundtable happening for trade unions on fossil fuel phase out. So it's really a whole week of activities. Some will be live streamed, some won't. It's coming together very quickly. But one thing that is very important, I think, for all of you to know is this is only the first in what is now being planned as a series of diplomatic conferences on fossil fuel phase out that will happen over the next year or two. And so I think that's really critical. And for many of us, it gave us a lot of hope at the end of COP, because the idea of a roadmap for fossil fuel phase out, as Daniela so amply put it at the beginning of this webinar, that there wasn't able to be agreement, of course, because the Paris process is a consensus-based process. There are many countries that didn't want a fossil fuel phase-out plan or roadmap to go ahead within that process. And for the first time, the president of COP recognized a process outside of the UN and outside of diplomatic space, where he said we weren't able to come to an agreement on the fossil fuel phase-out roadmap, but we welcome the efforts of countries meeting in Santa Marta. And in doing that, he kind of built a bridge to this diplomatic effort outside of the formal UN process. Maybe in the future, this diplomatic effort will lead to a fossil fuel treaty, which could be a companion to the Paris Agreement to help meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. It is not unusual for an issue in the UN system to have multiple treaties or agreements to address different aspects. And I think it's important for all of us as organizers, as activists, as government leaders to recognize that as I wanted to say meat gets put on the bones, but I realized maybe I shouldn't be using that frame anymore. Maybe as, we get some more substance to the conversation of fossil fuel phase out. Now, there are kind of fights emerging and differences emerging in how people perceive fossil fuel phase out should happen. And I think what I'm hearing in some of the diplomatic meetings is a lot of wealthy governments in the global north saying fossil fuel phase out is a national issue and it's fine for every country just to now file their fossil fuel phase out roadmaps. And those will become a global roadmap. The problem is that every country that's producing thinks they should be the last barrel sold, and they want to produce more and they want to have a longer timeline for phase out. And so I think what's really important to know is that if we're going to ensure that we do what many of the speakers today have talked about, if we ensure that we have support built into a fossil fuel phase out for the leapfrog in the global south, finance mechanisms, that we address debt in the fossil fuel phase out, that will require international cooperation, which is why 18 countries and many of us here are working on the fossil fuel treaty to create new mechanisms of international cooperation on debt, on tax, on tariffs, and a lot of the issues we've talked about here. And I think for us, that's the critical component that is necessary. So today we've talked a lot about various components that are necessary for a fossil fuel phase out and conversations that we really want to make sure happen at this exciting moment. I want to turn now back to our panel to ask them to reflect on the priority that they see in this moment of the how. How do we get this done? And what do you see as a critical priority that you want to leave people with in this conversation? I'm going to go backwards and come back to you first, Nessa.
Thank you very much. But for me, I'm coming away really, I feel like I've been much more empowered to know about the because it is easy to forget where we live, especially in Ireland, of where we live, that it's very easy to forget. We're so concerned with ourselves and about, how are we going to make the just transition ourselves and, I suppose rewetting the peatlands. We have a lot of peat in Ireland, so it's rewetting the peatlands, a big conversation around that and about just transition for workers. But like you just mentioned, I just think from me, from this conversation is how, and I think we're saying this all the time, that government policy can't be always just looking at the emissions of its own country. It has to look at upstream emissions. And I think often that, particularly again, when you're looking at LNG, that it's often that it's like invisible policy, that just because it's not spoken about doesn't mean that it means that you don't have to include it in your emissions. So I think that's so important for me, and it's to bring that message home. And me, I suppose, as a legislator, to continue to bring that message home about how much our use, not only are we as we need to transition ourselves, but also the effect that it's having on women and girls. And I'm actually going to bring that message back myself. It's something that I wouldn't have had huge emphasis on, but I am going to know. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Nessa. And I appreciate you bringing in the upstream. We've heard so much. I'm interested to see in the list of countries that came out yesterday that Canada and Australia are coming to Santa Marta, because both countries are dramatically increasing fossil fuel projects, and then saying they're climate leaders because they don't count their upstream emissions. They only count what they burn. And of course, they're using the excuse of carbon capture and storage as a way to justify their fossil fuel expansion. And that math just doesn't add up. And so I appreciate that we critically have to name that. I think several of our guests had connectivity issues or have had to leave, but MP Esther, I think you're still with us. Do you have some final thoughts on priorities for us? Not sure if you can hear us. Esther, are you there? No, she may have not been able to stay with us then. We're so thankful for the wisdom that has been shared today. It's really astounding. I think Celia said it so incredibly well, and so succinctly when she said fossil fuel exploitation is predatory. We heard today the incredible stat of the 1%, 1 degree. Someone asked me to repeat it. 1 degree of warming leads to a 5% increase in violence against women and girls. I did Google that with the UN, and you can find the reference there if you Google it. Incredible stat. So we know that what we're talking about in the phase out is not just about climate change, as if that wasn't enough to have a habitable planet. We know that what we're also talking about is the violence against women and girls, wars, oppression, droughts, extreme weather, pushing the planet beyond limits. We heard today about how a phase out can be more accessible, more democratic. This is about a redistribution of power in every sense of the word power. And we heard about the incredible role that women leadership is playing and can play, about how women are nurturing life, governing, as Esther said, for the next generation. We were urged by Cello to be the architects of solutions. And I think that's what being here and this community is doing. I want to hand over to Osprey for some final words, but I will just say that no one knows what the world holds right now and what the future holds. We live in unstable times, more so than I think many of us ever thought were possible. But we know that history is made by those who show up. So I want to thank you for showing up. Thank you for showing up to be a part of the WECAN community, the Fossil Fuel Treaty community, the movement for parliamentarians for a fossil-free future. Thank you for showing up for Santa Marta and for building the world we want. Osprey, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zipporah, and to all of the government leaders who joined us today for your incredibly important comments. And it's really important, I think, also in this moment, which we wanted to demonstrate today in this assembly, that there can be a relationship between civil society, the front lines, grassroots, and government leaders. And that's a very important bridge because most of the time, many of us who are working on the front lines or with frontline groups are battling governments to stop doing harm. That's often the role, unfortunately, we're in, which you think about it, it's insane that we live in a time in which we, the people, the everyday people, are fighting our governments to live, to have water, to care for our children, to have food, to make sure women are not violated. So it just seems so upside down and inside out that we're in the circumstance that we are, which we've talked about a lot, the systemic oppressions that have been going on for a long time that have led to this moment of institutionalized patriarchy, of colonization, of racism, of endless economic growth systems. But here we are, but also we're in this moment where we're reaching across, holding hands, even if it's on the internet, and we will be in Santa Marta with governments that want to do the right thing and are hosting this conference. And again, a shout out to the Fossil Fuel Treaty, the Parliamentarians for a Fossil-Free Future for pushing this agenda because we have to work collectively. We're not going to do this alone. And so I wanted just to really highlight this collective moment where we can work with government leaders, a lot of these amazing women who are leading the way in governments to do this work. And I also wanted to highlight from the session, that we also have to be careful going in Santa Marta. The conversation does not get co-opted because there will be government leaders who are fossil fuel producing countries who have not been on the same page with us and are not being bold and courageous. So we're also going as civil society to ensure that our demands are heard and that the agenda stays on course. So I wanted to also note that, as well as that, we're having a very deep conversation, yes, about fossil fuel phase out and energy, but we're having a conversation about power. We're having a conversation about global power and power dynamics. And this is where I really want to encourage everyone who's listening to the Assembly, all the women who are working from all sides in our ecosystem of effort to really stay connected, because it's not like we're up against something small. We're up against a power structure that is based on an extractive fossil fuel economy that has been in place for a long time, where the wealthy elite have been really in control. So this is something where we're going to be shoulder to shoulder and really be courageous and bold together and support one another, because this is the big, bold move. Getting off of fossil fuels is no small feat with the power that has been held by these industries hand in hand with governments for a long time. And so I'm thrilled about this assembly. I'm thrilled for the speaking out that people have done so far in this assembly, and so honored to have the leadership from this past panel. We look forward to being with you in Colombia and look forward to beyond. This is the beginning of the end and the beginning of something new. So thank you so much. We applaud you and we thank you so much for all your work and effort. And with that, we're going to go ahead and move to our next panel. We have a short little video we're going to show just to show some of the women in action before we get to the just transition conversation, which is so critical because it's not just about getting off of fossil fuels, it's about how. It's about how. So also stay tuned. We'll have a little break here with the video and then we'll resume with our final panel of the day. Thank you so much, Zipporah, and everyone on the panel. Thank you.